Okay, everybody, come on in. Sorry for the couple minutes delay. We had some technical difficulties. We think we've resolved them. So welcome. You're here in the right place for another edition of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And this edition of the Meetup, our 282nd, being recorded on Thursday, January 28th, 2021 at noon U.S. Eastern. We've got Pete Freitag again. And Pete will, as often does, talk to us about security, and particularly in this case, securing a ColdFusion application with Fixinator and FuseGuard. So awesome stuff. Pete, go ahead and take it away. Thanks for coming on.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. So today, in this presentation, I decided not to prepare any sort of slides or anything like that. I just wanted to go through this application, which some of you may have seen before if you've been to any of my talks. I tend to use this application because it's purposely written in such a way that it has lots of security vulnerabilities in it. So it's a good for demoing security issues. So what we're going to do to start is really just look at some of the security issues in this application. We'll just take a look at a couple of them, and then we'll look at how do we improve the security of this application using some tools, FuseGuard and Fixinator. All right, so the first issue we're going to look at is simply an SQL injection issue, which probably a lot of you are pretty familiar with. But this is what it looks like here. We've got, I'll just make that a little bigger. We've got this SQL query here with our CF query tag, and then we've got something like where ID equals URL.id. So the problem is that the attacker can mess around with this, and if we change this to like 1x, we start getting database errors. And so what the attacker could start to do is figure out, hey, you know what, I could do like semicolon some other SQL statement, and that works sometimes depending on the database. Sometimes it doesn't, or they might be able to say something like where ID equals 1 or 1 equals 1 or something like that, or 1 is some sort of condition that's true, and that can also cause it to return different things that the application developer maybe wasn't expecting. So for example, here, if we go here, we can actually grab all of the usernames and passwords from the database, from the users table here. By what we're doing here is we're running a union query, and we're saying select the ID, username, title, password, and the date that the user was created. And it's outputting all of that now on this page, just from this simple URL query string. So that's clearly something that's bad that we don't want within our applications, because it can lead to a lot of big problems, data loss. It can lead to, in a lot of cases with an SQL injection attack, the attacker could even take over the entire database server. If there happened to be a vulnerability within that, they might be able to take over the operating system that it's on, things like that. So that's clearly not a good thing to have. The next thing we'll take a look at is a cross-site scripting issue. So what we're doing here, if we search for something like interest, we're getting the results here, and it says your search for interest yielded 2 stories. If we search for something else, it's going to say, sorry, your search for whatever didn't turn up any results. So the problem here is we're just outputting this directly from the URL. So whatever comes in the URL, we're going to output here without doing anything to it. We're just outputting this URL.search right here in the code. So that can create something called a cross-site scripting issue. And what that allows is that the attacker can, in this case, I'm just doing an alert, a JavaScript alert with 1. But what that means is that the attacker can execute code from JavaScript in the victim's browser now. So that opens up a lot of different types of attacks that can lead to all sorts of things that aren't good for the victim of this attack. So it could even lead to you know, being compromised in just all sorts of different ways. So whenever we're outputting a variable from that's untrusted, we want to make sure it's encoded properly. So what we want to do is say something like encode for HTML like this, and try not to save it. Didn't save it. And then it's going to escape all this stuff. And if we look at it here, oh, it's not going to show there. If we look at it here, it's encoding it as ampersand LT. The brackets are encoded. All sorts of things are being encoded now to prevent it from executing. So that's how we can fix that one. I'm going to keep it broken for now. And just looking at the story, the way to fix that is, of course, going to be the CF query param tag value with value equals, and of course we can add this SQL type integer here as well. But as far as fixing the SQL injection part of this vulnerability, that you could even omit this, and it would still protect it from the SQL injection part of this. So, but it's a good practice for sure to include the SQL type here. And so that's how that one would be fixed and would prevent this from being exploited. Go back. All right, so if we retry this one, now we're saying, hey, this ID is not an integer. It's very easy to see that. And it doesn't even send it to the database server in this case. All right, so we'll reset this one as well. All right, let's take a look at one or two, maybe two more vulnerabilities here in this application. So on this about page, you'll notice here in the URL we've got page equals founder.html. So if we take a look at this, is what the code looks like, and then we've got some HTML in this folder here that it displays based on the URL. So the problem is this is not good, because we're letting the external users of this application through the URL scope manipulate a file path. And so anytime that can happen, it's usually a bad sign for when it comes to security. So we don't want to do that. But just to show you what can happen here. Okay, so for example, there's a config folder that's above the web root that has masterpassword.txt, which we just output here. So that's one example. Another example is, just change this 28. Here we're getting an output of all of the of a log file, and so we can actually even take this one step further here, and let's see. Well, we'll just leave it at that for now. I'll show you one more type of vulnerability within this application, and that's here in the contact form. So, all right, let's say we do, let's go into the admin here of the site. So in the admin here, we're displaying the messages that have been received through this contact form. And if we go look at this code. We look at the admin. This is the chunk of code here that's displaying the messages here. It's showing the name, the message date. And so what it's doing here is it's saying it's using the IIF function, which stands for inline if, and it's saying if they specify a contact name, then put that in, otherwise use anonymous. So what that means is if somebody fills out this form and doesn't include their name, it's just going to show anonymous here instead of their name. All right, so the problem though with this is that we can, the IF function actually evaluates code in the second and third arguments here. So the first part of this is a Boolean condition, and the second and third parts, you'll notice we have DE function here wrapped around it, which stands for delay execution, but it doesn't actually prevent the evaluation of it. So if I put a variable in this contact.name, it's actually going to be evaluated at runtime. So for example here, I can send one like that, or I can do one Mr. Now. And when I go back to the admin here, we're going to see here, here's Mr. Now, and here is the other one where we were actually reading a file. And of course we could have done anything we wanted at that point because it was actually evaluating the code. So what this form allows the attacker to do is really to execute any sort of code on the server. And so that type of vulnerability is called a remote code execution vulnerability. So those are a couple of vulnerabilities that exist within this application. So now we'll take a look at how can we improve the security of this application. It's full of a lot of holes. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to add FuseGuard to this application. So what FuseGuard's going to do is it's a chunk of code. It's actually a Web Application Firewall that's written in ColdFusion in CFML, and it sits in your application CFC file. And so it actually runs on request start, and ideally before any of your code in your application runs. FuseGuard's code goes through and inspects the request, looks for security issues within the request, and then it can decide to either log the issue or it can log and block the request. So let's take a look at what's involved with that. So FuseGuard, when you purchase it, you'll get a zip file, which when you extract it, looks kind of like this. So there's the documentation. There's an example application CFC or an example application CFM. If you happen to use application CFM and not an application CFC, that's okay. It'll still work with those as well. Or if you're using a script-based CFC, let me open this up. So you can just see what that looks like. And so this is really all it takes to include it into an application. In this case, we're just using like a single line here of code because we're using this FuseGuard application component. So this is kind of like a shortcut way to do it real simple. You can do it basically in 2 or 3 lines of code in your application CFC. I'll show you the application CFM example. So it's still pretty simple. We got 4 lines of code here to insert it into your application, and then so all your other stuff would go down here in your application CFM. So pretty straightforward to add it into your application. The other thing you'll need to do is you can take this FuseGuard folder and see, you'll actually copy that into your the root of your application here. So we're looking, what I did is I just took this FuseGuard folder from the zip and I copied it right into the root of my application. You don't have to put it into the web root. You can create a mapping if you want to, but it's just the easiest way to do it would be to just copy the entire folder into the web root. But you can actually keep it all outside of your main web root if you'd like to. So once we've done that, the third step to the installation would be that we're just going to create a couple database tables, and it's really just a few tables here. You can see, let's see, it looks like 6 tables here that it creates that we'll use to keep track of various things. So within this application, I've already added it to the application CFC. I just wrapped this Boolean here so that now I'm going to actually enable FuseGuard in this application. And you can see here, it's just the code here that's enabling it. And so if I go back, we can see that the application still actually works, which is a good thing because we don't want to break our application when we add something here. We want to make sure it's all still working properly. But what we'll notice is when we try some of these things like this, now it's going to start getting blocked by FuseGuard. So if I try, let's see, cross-site scripting. Here's another one. If I try the path traversal here, that's getting blocked now too. Even if I try something like this is getting blocked now as well. So now that's FuseGuard just running on its default configuration. But what you'll find in most cases is that you'll need to probably tweak the configuration a little bit, or there might be things that you want to enable or disable. So here's the FuseGuard manager. And this is basically has 2 purposes. One is to show you what it's been doing, what it's been blocking or logging. And the second purpose is to configure FuseGuard. So I should probably mention too, depending on how you like to set this up, you can actually do all of the configuration in CFC files if you don't want to use the database for configuration. So some people like to do that because then it keeps all of their configuration in version control and consistent across, if they've got a lot of different servers or different environments, they don't have to worry about synchronizing that configuration database. So that can work well in some cases. For most, I would say most users, they'll just end up using the database for configuration because it makes it very easy to edit the configuration. So you can see different things that it's blocking. Here is where it blocked that request for the path traversal, and it shows you all the details, the filter that blocked it as well, which is important when it comes to configuration. So the configuration of FuseGuard has a core set of configuration, which we can toggle whether it's enabled or not. This is something that's handy too, called log only mode. So I tend to like to use this if I'm setting up a new, if I'm adding FuseGuard to a new site, and I'd like to see which requests would have been blocked without actually blocking them. I can turn on log only mode, and what it'll do is it'll just log everything, and I can go in here and look at all the logs to see what things it's logging, and then I might say, you know what, I think we need to turn off this filter here because it's causing an issue, or we might need to tweak the configuration of that filter so that it doesn't cause an issue with our application. So in most cases, there'll be 1 or 2 things that you'll need to tweak within the configuration. So it's important to know that that's a good approach, is to run in log only mode. The fail open would be if if FuseGuard happened to throw some sort of internal exception, like for example, if it's trying to access the database and it can't access it, what should it do? Should it fail open or should it fail close? So failing open means that it will allow the request through. Failing close means if any sort of exception happens, then it's going to block the request. So that, which is of course more secure, but you may not necessarily want to have that enabled. So as far as the IP address goes, if you happen to be behind some sort of load balancer or proxy server and you use the X forwarded for header, contains your actual IP address, that's just a flip of a switch here, and we'll use that. And then finally we get to the log levels and block levels. So in order to understand what that is, we have to look at what the concept of these filters are. So there are, for example, there's an SQL injection filter, which is looking specifically for SQL injection attacks. And if it finds one, it's going to return this threat level of, which is a number between 0 to 10. So if it returns a threat level of 0, that means it didn't see any problems with the request. If it returns a threat level of 10, it means it's most likely an attack. And so you can decide how you want to block or log requests. So you might say, you know what, I'm going to log anything that FuseGuard thinks, and this is how it is right here by default. I'm going to log anything that FuseGuard thinks might be a threat, and then, but I'm only going to block things that it thinks are very high risk. So that can be useful. So we can see here each of these filters has different settings. You can toggle them on or off. You can tell it which parts of the request to look for, or you can even tell it certain variables to ignore. So this is a good example of a filter that works really, really well, but there's some cases where you might need to tweak the configuration. So this is called the ID validation filter, and what it does is it looks at any variables ending in ID, and it checks to see if they match patterns that are typical of an ID. So that would be like a UUID or an integer, and if it doesn't match those patterns, then it blocks it. And so that actually works very well in preventing a lot of attacks. But you might have a case where there's a certain type of ID that doesn't match the pattern, so you have to allow that particular variable. So let's say you had form.someID, which was some crazy format, then you would just add it there and save the configuration, and it would ignore it. So you can see each of these filters does a different job in protecting your application. And if you find one of them is you don't like the way it works, you can disable it, or you can, since each of these filters is essentially a CFC, you could actually, and some of our customers do this, they extend the CFC and implement their own custom logic within it that works well within their application, or you could just disable the filter. So finally, there's also within FuseGuard, besides the filters, there's this notion of loggers, which are basically when FuseGuard logs something, it can support different ways of different, they're kind of like event handlers to deal with the log. So the one that we have enabled here by default is the DB logger, but there's also one that we could add that would send an email, say like every hour, with a summary of anything that was blocked within that hour, and it only sends the email if things were blocked. So there's different, or you could have a CF log logger that uses the CF log tag to log everything to a file. So depending on how you want to handle logging, there's different ways of doing that. So that's pretty much the basics of FuseGuard. It can take only 10 minutes or so to get it set up and running. As we saw, it's pretty much just copying that file over setting up the database, and adding a couple lines to your application, CFC or CFM. So, and as we saw, we're now blocking all sorts of things in our application that we had as a vulnerability previously, and it didn't take us very long to enable this. So it's kind of like a low amount of work, high amount of reward type of thing that you can do to improve your security. All right, so the next tool I want to show you is called Fixinator. So Fixinator works as a command box command. So if you're not familiar with command box is a command line interface tool, which means like something you'd open up if you're on a Windows user. You might open up command prompt, and then when you type in commands to the command prompt, that's like a command line tool. If you're on Linux or Mac and you open up your shell or your terminal or an SSH to a server and you start typing in commands, that's a command line interface. So this is a command line tool that's written in ColdFusion. It's made by Orta Solutions, and they've done a great job with this tool, and it has a lot of really handy features that we could do a whole presentation on those features. But one of the things that it allows you to do is write your own command line tools in ColdFusion. So Fixinator is a ColdFusion code security scanning tool. So it will take your source code, scan through it, and look for security issues within the source code. And then it will come up with a list of the findings from it. And, well, probably the best to just show you. I'm just going to bump up the size of this terminal here. Okay. So I'm running Visual Studio Code here, and if you're running Visual Studio Code, there's a tab called Terminal, and really all I did is I just typed box, and it starts up the command box. So right now I'm in command box as my shell, and then so the next step, once you have command box up and running, and this is covered, and I probably should have mentioned the first step would be that you need an API key to work with Fixinator. Because it's a commercial product, the way this works is it will, once you have an API key, the code gets sent to a scanning server, which is run on AWS Lambda. So it doesn't keep a copy of your code or anything like that. It actually gets recycled like every hour or so. The entire server gets wiped out and rebuilt again. And this is one way of running it, would be with this API, with the cloud API. If you do decide to purchase the enterprise version of this tool, you can actually run the scanning server locally, which is what I'm doing right now, is I'm using the enterprise version, so I don't have to send the code over the network at all, and it just scans it all locally. So once you have the API key, you need to have command box installed. If you're on Mac, you can simply use Homebrew as the easiest way. Windows, you can just download box.exe, double click it, or put it in your path if you want to run it from anywhere. And then you're going to run box install, or you're going to run install Fixinator, and that's going to install the Fixinator command. So once you have Fixinator installed, you can actually start scanning some code. So for example, if I just run Fixinator by itself, it's going to scan this entire code directory here and output all sorts of results that it found. Obviously in this application it's going to find a lot of things, but maybe let's say I'm working in the news section. I might just start here in the news section. Let's see here, I found that Sql injection we were just looking at. But so you'll notice also it will give us some possible fixes here. And this is where Fixinator gets kind of cool, because if we go here, so now we're looking at this news.story.cfm. We're looking at this particular vulnerability here, and if I run Fixinator, I can now say autofix equals prompt, and you can actually, there's an autofix equals auto, which will just go and fix everything without asking you how you want to fix it. But I wouldn't recommend doing that. In most cases, you're probably going to want to go through and decide how you want to fix each one. So we're going to run autofix equals prompt, and then I'm going to give it the file. I could run it against the whole directory, but I'm just going to do this one here. So it's telling me here, hey, I found this Sql injection. How do you want to fix it? In this case, I know it's an integer here, so I'm just going to say number 2 here. And you can see here, it just fixed the code here. So we can see if we do our diff here, this is what it actually did, what it changed it to. So at this point, we fixed this Sql injection. So if we run this again, Fixinator on it, we run it again. Right, it's going to tell us, hey, I didn't find anything wrong in that file. We fixed it, and that was super easy, like way easier even than typing CF query param on it. So if you've got a lot of SQL injection issues or cross-site scripting issues or various types of issues within your code, you can run Fixinator on it, and it will help you fix them a whole lot faster. So that's just one of the reasons you might like to use it. We'll look at some other things you can do. So the other thing I wanted to mention was the confidence setting here. So by default, Fixinator runs with confidence set to high. So what that means is it's not going to bother telling you about stuff it's not sure is vulnerable. It's only going to tell you things that it really is pretty sure that you're going to want to fix. So that's how it defaults, and that's because once you first run the tool, especially if you have a really large code base, you might get a little overwhelmed with, okay, this is telling me to do a whole lot of things. So what you can do is kind of focus on the highest confidence ones, which are most likely issues, and then you can lower the confidence as you fix those. And you can also set the severity. You could start it on, the severity defaults to low by default, but if you wanted to, you could just say, all right, I only want to see the high severity, high confidence issues by default. But you can also set the confidence to low, and it's going to find a whole lot more things wrong with this. So for example, now it's finding some cross-site scripting issues within this. And so, for example, in search, we could see here that it's telling me that it could fix these cross-site scripting issues by adding an encode for HTML to these instances. So again, we could go through this and fix this file really quickly. And in fact, why don't we give the Fixinator autofix equals auto a try here and see if it works good for this path equals search.cfm. Okay. Oops. Did I do right file? Yeah, search. Oh, I forgot the confidence. Okay, so now you can see here that it fixed this SQL issues, and it fixed the cross-site scripting issues in this file as well. So that's pretty cool thing that it supports. So another thing you can do if you want to, so we can set the confidence to low. is we can have Fixinator produce different reports. So if we look at the result formats that it supports, and I'm just hitting tab here and it tells me all the possible ones that it supports. It could support outputting all these as a CSV file. It can do an HTML file or a PDF file. It also supports some other formats like JUnit, which is useful for integrations within continuous integration, which we'll look at in a bit. Or it can just output like a JSON format as well. Find bugs is another one that's useful for continuous integration, as well as the SAST format. So here though, let's just create a PDF. We'll just create a fixinator.pdf. So it's going to go through. Now we're scanning the entire code base here. And we can see here, I just created this Fixinator. And we open that up. We've got a nice PDF detailing all of the findings here that it was finding. So we can go through and you can, however you want to deal with that, print it out and go through it like that way, or whatever you'd like. So, all right, I want to show you one other thing that is I haven't really showed too many people this before. So this is a new feature of Fixinator called the Fixinator Gui, and this is actually a Mac or a Windows application that you can download. And it's a GUI interface. If you're not really too happy about having to type commands in or remembering what commands do what, this is a GUI version of it. So if I can hit scan here, and it goes through and scans my code, and then I can go through and look through these issues. So for example, if you remember, one of the issues we looked at was that this line of code here, where it allowed, when somebody submitted in the contact form, it allowed remote code execution. So what's cool is I can go into here now and say, all right, I want to fix this file, and it will show me an editor here where I can see the code and say, all right, what it's going to do is it's going to rewrite this code into this code here. And I can say, yeah, that looks good. Save it. It's just telling me it's going to overwrite it. And so now it's telling me that no issues are found in this file because it went through, after I did this, it rescanned it and found that the issue was fixed. So now you see that in this report here, I no longer have that IIF issue in here. So, yeah, let me just show you. Let's take a look at one with multiple so yeah, and if you do want, okay, this particular one has different options. So when you have different options, you can select which one you want to use to fix it within the file here. All right, so yeah, here's another case where it's suggesting, you know, an application CFC setting that we should have set, which would have prevented another type of attack I didn't show you here today, but so yeah, this is a pretty useful way to go through your Fixinator reports and to see all of the issues that it's finding in a graphical way. All right, so I wanted to mention another feature of Fixinator. So if you create this file in the root of the folder that you're scanning in, and it's called .fixinator.json, you can kind of give it some default options for it to use. So for example, if I don't want it to scan this tools folder for whatever reason, I can add some paths to ignore so that it's not scanning that by default. Or if there's certain file extensions that I don't want it to scan, I can tell it to ignore those. Or even, like, for example, all right, let me see. So if I just run application CFC, and let's say I don't want it to warn me about this particular issue, I can just tell it here to ignore that particular issue and scan again. And so now it's giving me a different warning. It's not warning me about such cookie not secure. It's warning me about that it's not HTTP only. So that I could specify different scanners if I didn't want them. Like, for example, sometimes cross-site scripting scanner might have a lot of results, and when you're first getting started, maybe you say, all right, I'm not going to start with those issues. I'm going to start with ones that are maybe slightly more critical first, and then I'll add those back in. So these ignore patterns are also useful. So let's say, for example, here in this search.cfm, instead of using encode for HTML, maybe I have some sort of custom function that I wrote, like my custom encoder. And in order to tell Fixinator, you know what, don't worry about that function, I can tell it for the cross-site scripting scanner, ignore this pattern here. So any variables that have that in it, we can assume are going to be safe, and so it won't ignore those. You can do the same thing for, let's say, the Sql Injection Filter. Like sometimes maybe you have application, like let's say you have like a CF query like this. Oops, that's not, whatever. Something like that, and you know, Fixinator might say, hey, you know, you've got a variable here in this query. You should that might be vulnerable to SQL injection. With this fixinator.json, we can say, you know what, that application.table prefix is safe because we hard code that value, so you don't have to worry about that one in particular. So there's another way too that you can do this. So I'm just going to run Fixinator test.cfm. All right, so you'll notice that it's not. If I get rid of this, so. Okay, so you'll notice here that it's complaining right now about this possible remote code execution with the evaluate function here. But maybe in my code I could just say ignore the evaluate issue because this variable is statically defined, so you don't have to worry about that. So now if I save that, run Fixinator again, it's no longer complaining about it. And it is complaining about a different type of issue here, reverse tab nabbing, which is, I don't think we have time to go into the details on that one, but just to show you, you know, there's all sorts of issues potentially that it can find within your code that you might not even realize are in there. So definitely enlightening to run tools like this against your code to see what comes up. So another cool thing you can do with Fixinator is to run it in a continuous integration environment. So what I mean by that is, so right here I'm on GitLab, and what I've done is I've added this file called .gitlabci.yml, and what this does is I'm telling it to install command box, install Fixinator, and then run Fixinator on this code, on the code that's in this repository. And GitLab will run this, execute this file every time code is committed and pushed to the repository. So for example, if I go here and I just edit this file, commit changes, what we're going to see happen is, so now it's running that file that we just showed you. It's actually going to execute it, and so Fixinator is running. While it's doing that, so there is an entire continuous integration guide that covers all different ways of running. So if it doesn't matter if you're running in Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps, AWS Code Build, or if you happen to be using something like Jenkins or TeamCity or Circle CI or Travis CI, there are guides that go through the setup process of adding Fixinator to it so that it can run every time you commit code to your repository. So what's cool about this is that you could actually set it up so that if Fixinator doesn't find anything, then it considers it a successful build, or you can set it up so that if Fixinator finds something, then it's flagged as an unsuccessful build, and you're kind of alerted and it stops your whole pipeline. So let's say you're making a quick fix, but you're actually also introducing a security vulnerability that Fixinator picks up on. It's going to stop you from potentially deploying that fix into production. So that's kind of cool. And what's nice about this is that when it's in continuous integration, it will run every time it commits. So you don't have to remember to scan your code for security issues. It's going to do it automatically. Once you spend you can see this isn't very hard to do, to set up. It's just, like 20 lines of code that you add into a file. You can set this up in 10 minutes, and every time you commit code to your repository, it's going to start scanning it. And let's see. So if I go back to the pipelines here, click on this. Here I'm not having it fail, but I am having it. GitLab has the ability to, if I use one of those report formats called SAST, then GitLab is able to take all the results from Fixinator, and it's showing me all of the results that it's finding here. So you can see Fixinator SQL injection, and it's even telling you how to fix it. Solution, replace URL.id with CF query param. So that's all done through Fixinator. It's producing all of this user interface here. So yeah, one thing that this reminds me of that I didn't talk about is that Fixinator, besides finding ColdFusion vulnerabilities in your code like we've seen, it can also find vulnerable JavaScript libraries in your code. It can find vulnerable Java jar files in your code, and it can find known vulnerable ColdFusion components. So it can look at, for example, if you're using command box to install packages, it can look at the box.json to look for vulnerable packages, or it can even, a good example is that everybody's probably aware of is like the old FCK editor file upload vulnerability. If you happen to have that vulnerable piece of code in your code base somewhere, Fixinator will detect that and point it out to you. All right, I think that was pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. I'd be happy to take questions.
All right, Pete, thank you for that. And I'll just say that currently it seems like the only outstanding question, you'll see if you want later, you can read the back and forth, but I think the only outstanding question right now is the one I'm putting up on the screen now, and there's a couple parts to it. So Adrienne asks, with FuseGuard, can it do pattern matching against incoming data to look for issues like SSN or credit card numbers, or things that people shouldn't be entering in some use cases? And he goes on to say, like someone posts an SSN into a chat message, can it block the message or finally strip out the SSN?
So that's a good question. It does have a filter called the variable pattern filter, which you can set up with different patterns. It doesn't necessarily look for credit card numbers like that by default, or social security numbers, but it would be very simple to set up the variable pattern filter to do that and to block the request. Now it doesn't actually, it wouldn't mask or filter out those variables, and that's intentional, because from just what I've seen in terms of tools that tend to take like user input and then manipulate them and then give them back to the developer tend to be very difficult to work with from the developer perspective. So FuseGuard will either block the request, log the request, or allow the request. It won't manipulate any of the data coming into the request, because I think that leads to problems. Great question.
Anybody else have any questions? And while you're waiting for them, Pete, I don't think I saw during your showing of Fixinator that you mentioned that it can also produce various forms of output if people want it to, separate from the UI. The command line had the ability to create different forms of output, or did you cover that?
Yes, I did show that.
Okay, sorry, I might have looked away.
What Charlie's talking about is the ability to do reports. I think I got one up here somewhere. So you can do PDF reports, CSV reports, JSON reports. Here's the PDF one that we had generated previously. Yeah, one other thing I could mention too is if you're interested in purchasing these tools or trying them, you can definitely do that with FuseGuard. You can request an evaluation. Go to Foundeo.com, find your way to FuseGuard. There's a form where you can request a evaluation copy. With Fixinator, you get you can request a trial API key that lets you scan only one file at a time. But it's a good way to evaluate the tool, see if it's going to be useful to you. And then finally, you can purchase Fixinator, FuseGuard, and a third tool that we have that I didn't talk about today called HackMyCF.
Yeah.
Which Charlie's a fan of. Thank you, Charlie.
Big fan. You bet. Of all of them.
Awesome. And so you can get that all bundled into one price, which is discounted if you get all three.
Hey, before we go on to Adrian's next question, following up on his previous one, I don't remember if this is something you covered, but it's worth pointing out that with FuseGuard and the CFC-based configuration, because you didn't really show it, so people wouldn't necessarily connect these dots. Once you license it, that code is open, and you can look at it. And if it doesn't do something you want it to do in a way that's not easily changed by a configuration feature, you could modify the code. Of course, if you modify the code, then there's the chance that when you come out with a new version, that could be lost. But do you want to speak to that possibility for people?
Yeah. So what I tend to recommend to somebody, if they, instead of modifying the actual core file, what you can do is extend the CFC, and then you can add your tweak in the extended version if that works. It doesn't work in all cases, but there are cases where you maybe say, you know what, in almost all cases, I think there's a configuration option that should help you get around having to actually modify the code. Like you can tell it to ignore a variable, or you can tell it to ignore a particular URI. Like let's say you're having the cross-site scripting filter doesn't like your WYSIWYG editor form because it submits all sorts of HTML and stuff. And in this case, you know what, we want to allow that. So you can tell the cross-site scripting filter to ignore the path /admin/WYSIWYG edit.cfm or whatever it might be.
And then here was Adrian's next question about Fixinator and the big bucket integration. Does that only work on the cloud, or can it work self-hosted?
It can work self-hosted as well. So you could actually spin up the Fixinator server inside the continuous integration environment along before you run the Fixinator command. It's the Fixinator server itself is very small, so it's like I don't know, maybe like 150 kilobytes or something like that, zipped. So it doesn't take a whole lot of resources to spin up that and have it scan. So yeah, that definitely can work in a Bitbucket integration, right? Any type of CI integration.
And Adrian also chimed in on being a fan of HackMyCF. Highly recommend it when you inherit a legacy app. And honestly, everybody should have. And that's the quote on the site that I have from several years ago, and I haven't changed that recommendation. I think everybody should have HackMyCF. It's just so insightful, and to keep an eye on stuff at a config level. And folks, just check those things out. In fact, Pete, I don't know if you were going to show something with the URLs, but let me go ahead and I've already got the other ones lined up. Let me just so here's Fixinator. I'll drop it in. And when I drop it into the chat, it goes out to everybody. If you were to drop it in, you'd have to do it in the YouTube interface. So there's Fixinator, there's FuseGuard, and then let me get HackMyCF, which you can get to all of them with just Foundeo.com.
You should be able to get to all Fixinator, HackMyCF, and FuseGuard right from the homepage there.
And Fixinator can be reached directly by that fixinator.app, or go through Foundeo, and you can always get a link to them all. And you'll see some of them have trials. Most of them have substantial documentation. Some you'll get more once you get it, but usually what's provided up front should be enough to help you decide that it's in your interest to get it.
Yeah, and with all three, I help customers all the time with questions. So don't hesitate to ask. Shoot me an email, pete@foundeo.com. If you have any questions about anything, licensing, just security in general, happy to answer.
Then we see Larry's asking about the URL for the bundle, and I'm looking at the pricing page on HackMyCF, and I don't see the bundle listed there, but I remember seeing it in the other pages, like Fixinator's page. And
yeah, you can actually sign up right from, if you go to HackMyCF, you can get to the bundles here.
Right. But if you look at that pricing and sign up page up at the top, I don't think it's offered on that on that page. It's just something for later.
Charlie coming up with that.
Just trying to help. Gonna be on my gravestone. I was just trying to help.
I think if you go.
But I do believe that on the other ones, it's more obvious, either Fixinator or FuseGuard. It's more obvious that there's a bundle. There you go.
Yeah, I gotta work on that. Thanks.
You bet. And of course, just email him, go to the site. And if you can't find something you need, he's got links to reach out to him directly. And in fact, the site now has pop-up with chat and stuff like that. Yeah. So you can just reach out that way, Larry and others. Yeah. Reach right into his brain. That's what it does. It connects you to his brain. And that's what all this stuff does. And what a brain it is. And aren't we blessed to have it and to be, so many people benefit from all these great things that you create, Pete. And he didn't mention it in this talk, but he wrote the lockdown guides for ColdFusion going all the way back to CF8. And he did not write the auto lockdown tool that Adobe created in CF 2018, but he did modify the lockdown guide starting in 2018 to work with that. By the way, have you yet come out with the 2021 guide yet?
Yeah, it should be out soon.
And is that one also written to presume people have run the auto lockdown, or is it back to not requiring that?
Oh. Yeah, it does. And the main reason for that is that if I did it both ways, I think it would just be like such an overwhelming document. And actually, I found with the 2021 that the auto lockdown tools work much more smooth than it was.
Oh, that's good to hear. I hadn't even tried it. That's very good if that's true.
So in my testing, I wasn't like when I wrote the 2018 lockdown guide, I encountered all sorts of issues with the auto lockdown tool that I had to, go back and forth with Adobe on. But this time I didn't really encounter too much.
Well, that's really
So,
encouraging to hear, because
hopefully-
that has been a bit of a bummer that the auto lockdown tool sometimes made some decisions that were very difficult to recover from. So that's cool. And that might be a talk itself if you wanted to do it, or Adobe wanted to do it, and happy to have, because I don't, there's a lot of people that don't even know CF has an auto lockdown tool, because for those who don't know, it's really a separate tool that you're offered when you download ColdFusion, and it'd be easy to miss that it's offered on the page as a link. You have to know that it's there. And then you do hear some people talk about it, even Adobe, but often you don't hear much chatter. So we're talking about a tool that came out with 2018, which will do almost everything that's in the lockdown, that was in the lockdown guide. It just does it. But I will say that some people have had trouble where when they did it, it was like, kind of like we've talked about this with the lockdown guide. If somebody just started from page 1 and went to page 85 and did everything in it, they would often find, oh crap, something doesn't work, because somewhere along the way, one of those things made something so secure that they're not expecting the implication to be that either their code doesn't do something it's supposed to do, or they can't do something that they've typically done on the server. So the lockdown tool tended to just do everything, and that can surprise you. So you'll want to read that guide. One other thing I want to point out that's, and you can tell us the stance on this, but many people didn't know that Pete had also done an developer security guidelines. So many people knew about the lockdown guide, but then they didn't, unless they paid attention to the paragraph and that ended that said, and don't forget, you should also secure your code. And there's a developer security guidelines document, but that was in 8 and 9 and 10 and 11, and it hadn't been updated since 11. Is that still the case? Okay.
Yeah, that hasn't been updated in probably 5 years or so.
But one can kind of think of Fixinator as the tool that does what the developer security guidelines tell you to do. So get the tool or read the book. And the book has not been updated, so it's better to get the tool because it's been updated.
For sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Anybody else have any? And thank you, Larry, for your commenting that you've benefited from his lockdown guide for years. Thank you for that. Anybody else have any questions or comments as we wrap up, if that's it? Or is there anything else, Pete, you wanted to say before we move on?
No, I don't think so. Well, just thank you, everybody, for attending, and Charlie and Dan, of course, for hosting. Thank you.
You betcha. Happy to have you. And yes, Dan, thanks for his contributions and helping to organize things. He organized this one with you, so thank you for that. I don't think there was anything in the comments prior to here at the end that was anything that you needed to address. I'm looking back quickly. I don't think so. No, doesn't look like it. Nope. All right. So we'll leave it at that. So thanks again, Pete. Oh, and let me say that all the sessions are recorded. This one was recorded. And as soon as we're done, the recording will be there at the YouTube page you're currently looking at. The chat won't show up until tomorrow for some strange reason. YouTube is just really slow to get the chat to appear, but it's already linked to on recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com as well. So you can tell people to find it that way if they're interested.
Okay.
And
Sounds good.
yeah, thank you, Pete. All right, sir. So long, everybody. Till the next time. Well, something next week. See you.